The banana on the table cost 13 cents in Boston. In Guatemala City, it had already cost 300 lives, and by Thursday, it would cost a democracy. June 27, 1954. A humid Wednesday night in Guatemala's presidential palace. President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman sits alone in his office, staring at a telephone that hasn't rung in 48 hours. The air smells of rain and diesel smoke drifting through the open window. Every ally he called, Mexico, Argentina, the United Nations, gave him the same response: silence. Outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond the capital, American-supplied bombers circle like vultures. But the war wasn't lost in the sky. It was lost 3 years earlier in a Manhattan office tower when a man who sold cigarettes decided to sell a revolution. Let's rewind to where this really begins. Not in 1954, but in 1899. The United Fruit Company didn't enter Guatemala, it purchased it. By 1930, United Fruit owned more land in Central America than any individual owned anywhere on Earth. 42% of Guatemala. Not just the plantations, the railroads, the telegraph lines, the only major port. If you wanted to ship coffee, beef, or timber out of the country, you paid United Fruit. If you wanted to communicate with the outside world, you asked United Fruit for permission. The government in Guatemala City was a formality, a puppet theater for tourists. The real capital was in Boston, in a corner office at 1 Federal Street, where men in pressed suits decided the price of labor, land, and lives. They paid their workers 65 cents a day, sometimes in company scrip, worthless paper only redeemable at company stores where a can of beans cost what it would in New York. The workers lived in wooden barracks, 40 men to a room, sleeping in hammocks strung between posts. When the banana blight came in 1935, United Fruit didn't treat the diseased plants. They abandoned entire plantations, left thousands unemployed, and moved operations 30 miles east where the soil was still fresh. The workers, the towns that had grown around those plantations, ghosts by winter. But here's what made El Pulpo truly untouchable. It wasn't just an economic power, it was a propaganda machine. Enter Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, the man who convinced American women to smoke by calling cigarettes torches of freedom, the man who sold bacon and eggs as the quintessential American breakfast by paying doctors to endorse it. In 1951, United Fruit hired Bernays for a single purpose: to make land reform look like Soviet invasion. The problem was simple. In March 1952, Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, signed Decree 900, the agrarian reform law. It was modest, even by New Deal standards. The government would purchase unused land from large estates, compensate the owners at the value they themselves had declared for tax purposes, and redistribute it to landless peasants. Fair, legal, necessary. But United Fruit had declared the value of its land absurdly low to avoid taxes. Now the Guatemalan government was offering them exactly what they'd claimed it was worth. United Fruit stood to lose 400,000 acres. That meant losing control. So Bernays went to work. He didn't need to convince Guatemala, he needed to convince America. Bernays organized press junkets, flying American journalists to Guatemala on United Fruit's dime. They were given tours, not of the plantations, but of evidence of Soviet influence. A book by Lenin in a university library, a mural with socialist imagery in a public square, testimonies from concerned citizens, who were, coincidentally, on United Fruit's payroll. The journalists returned home and wrote what they'd been shown. Time magazine called Arbenz a tool of Moscow. The New York Times warned of a red beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. None of it was true. Arbenz wasn't a communist. He was a nationalist. His crime wasn't allegiance to Stalin. It was the audacity to believe that Guatemalan land should belong to Guatemalans. But truth is a weak opponent against fear. And in 1954, in the shadow of McCarthyism, fear was the only currency that mattered. By January 1954, Bernays' campaign had worked. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, were convinced, or at least they claimed to be. Both men had deep ties to United Fruit. John Foster Dulles had worked as the company's lawyer. Allen Dulles had served on its board. The company's principal stockholder, Sam Zamuri, was a personal friend. The Dulles brothers went to President Eisenhower with a fabricated intelligence report. Guatemala was becoming a Soviet satellite. If the U.S. didn't act, the dominoes would fall. Mexico, Panama, the Canal. Eisenhower, weary from Korea and paranoid about communism, gave the green light. Operation PBSUCCESS was born. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Don't invade. Simulate an invasion. The CIA recruited a Guatemalan exile, Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, to lead a liberation army of exactly 480 men, mercenaries, ex-soldiers, criminals promised land and money. They were stationed just across the Honduran border at a makeshift base built with United Fruit Company resources. The CIA provided the weapons, the radios, the aircraft, but the real war wasn't fought with bullets, it was fought with ghosts. On June 18, 1954, Castillo Armas's forces crossed the border and advanced 15 miles into Guatemala. It was barely a skirmish, a few firefights with demoralized rural police. But in Guatemala City, every radio station suddenly carried the same broadcasts. Reports of massive invasions, of thousands of troops, of cities falling one by one. The voice was confident, urgent, terrifying. It was all lies. The broadcasts came from a CIA transmitter in Honduras. The planes bombing Guatemala City, there were only 3 of them, ancient P-47 Thunderbolts flown by American pilots. But they flew low, circled endlessly, dropped the occasional grenade on empty buildings. The psychological effect was total. The message was clear. Resistance is futile. Arbenz knew it was a bluff. But his generals didn't. His cabinet didn't. The public didn't. The cruelest part? The one nation that could have stopped it, the United States, was the one orchestrating it. Arbenz tried to purchase weapons from anywhere. Europe, Mexico, even Czechoslovakia, in a desperate gamble. When the Czechs finally agreed, the US immediately cited it as proof of Soviet control. The trap was perfect. Defend yourself, and you're a communist. Surrender, and you're a coward. On June 27th, 9 days after the invasion began, Arbenz's senior officers came to him with an ultimatum: resign, or we will remove you. Not because they supported the coup, but because they believed the radio broadcasts. They believed the war was lost. At 9:15 p.m., Arbenz addressed the nation on the radio. His voice was steady, but the words cracked with bitterness. I have not violated my faith in democratic freedoms, in the independence of Guatemala, and in all the good that is the future of humanity, but I am resigning because I want to preserve the peace and avoid further bloodshed. He didn't mention United Fruit by name. He didn't need to. By midnight, he was in the Mexican embassy. By dawn, Castillo Armas walked into the capital unopposed, carried on the shoulders of soldiers who had never fired a shot in anger. Castillo Armas immediately reversed Decree 900, returned every acre to United Fruit, dissolved the labor unions, banned opposition parties. Over the next 4 decades, Guatemala descended into one of the bloodiest civil wars in Latin American history. 200,000 dead, most of them indigenous Mayans who had supported land reform. The term Banana Republic was born here, not as a joke, as an autopsy report. And United Fruit, rebranded in 1970 as Chiquita Brands International, still operating, still profitable. The men in the Boston boardroom retired with pensions and country club memberships. Edward Bernays lived to 95, gave interviews, wrote books, never expressed regret. The banana on your counter this morning traveled through a supply chain built on this blueprint, where profit isn't just protected by law, but by the law's collapse, where sovereignty is a product that can be bought, sold, and demolished when it becomes inconvenient. Arbenz died in exile in Mexico City in 1971, drowned in his bathtub. The official report said heart attack. He was 57 years old. His daughter later said he never stopped listening to the radio, waiting for the broadcasts to stop, waiting to hear the truth. But the truth had been classified, locked in a CIA vault. It wouldn't be declassified until 1997, 26 years after his death. By then, nobody cared. The bananas were cheap. The coffee was fair trade. The blood had dried. Hold on, Black. No music, just rain. Fade out.